The millionaire CEO had booked an entire restaurant for his daughter's birthday, but when the 8-year-old sat alone at the table, a single question from a stranger would change all their lives forever. The restaurant's private dining hall was all polished wood, soft golden lighting, and the faint hum of muted conversation drifting from beyond the heavy double doors. The table reserved for Emma Reed looked like something from a luxury magazine spread. A gleaming white cloth, crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and a three-tiered cake decorated with golden swirls and delicate sugar roses. The candles, 8 of them, waited unlit, their polished wicks catching the light. Emma sat at the head of the table, small and impossibly fragile against the expanse of the chair beneath her. The wheelchair was sleek and custom-fitted, its brushed metal frame a silent reminder of the accident that had changed her life. She wore a pale blue dress that complemented the warm tone of her skin and the soft brown of her hair, which had been neatly brushed back and fastened with a silver clip. She looked like a porcelain doll, beautiful, still, and somehow lonely. Jonathan Reed stood several steps away, his phone pressed to his ear, murmuring into it with the measured, commanding tone that made him one of the most respected hotel magnates in the state. His eyes flicked to his daughter between sentences, softening briefly before returning to the business at hand. He didn't want her to see the guilt in them. He'd planned the evening meticulously. The finest restaurant in the city, the most expensive cake on the menu, the best service money could buy. And yet the table around her was empty. Emma's small hands rested in her lap, fingers tracing the embroidered hem of her dress. She glanced at the door every few moments, as if willing someone to walk through. Her father's business acquaintances had sent expensive gifts, perfume, books, even a designer handbag she was far too young to use. But none of them were here. School friends had declined politely. Some parents never replied at all. She was too different now, they thought. Too fragile. And Jonathan knew it. The server approached quietly, asking if they should bring out the cake. Jonathan shook his head almost imperceptibly. He wanted to give it a few more minutes, even though he knew no one else was coming. He could see the shadow in Emma's eyes, the way she tried to sit up straighter, to smile as if it didn't matter. It broke something inside him. For a moment, he wished he could turn back time, erase the accident, erase the long months of hospitals and whispered pity, erase the isolation that clung to his daughter, no matter how much he tried to shield her. Money could buy her comfort, treatment, opportunities. But it couldn't buy what she wanted most, the feeling of belonging. He ended the call abruptly, sliding the phone into his pocket. "How's my birthday, girl?" he asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Daddy," Emma said softly, her voice polite, almost formal. She was 8 years old, and yet there was something in her tone that sounded older, a quietness that children shouldn't have to carry. Jonathan pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, forcing the weight of the evening into the background. He would make this a celebration, even if it was only the two of them. But in the silence that stretched between them, he could feel how empty the room really was. Outside the double doors, a different kind of life was moving. A blur of conversations, laughter, clinking glasses. And somewhere in that hum, change was already walking toward them, though neither father nor daughter could have guessed it yet. The doors to the restaurant swung open with a soft rush of warm air, carrying with it the faint scent of rain from the street outside. Rachel Morris stepped in, brushing a stray strand of dark hair from her cheek. She held her son Lucas's hand firmly, partly to guide him, partly to keep him from darting ahead in his usual burst of energy. It had been a long day. She just finished grading a stack of essays, and Lucas had been restless at home. Dinner out was meant to be a small treat, something to break the monotony. The maître d' greeted her with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for patrons who looked as though they belonged, but Rachel knew she didn't. Not in a place like this, with its gold-trimmed menus and crystal chandeliers. Still, she smiled politely and followed him past tables filled with elegant couples and well-dressed families. Lucas was quiet for once, his gaze darting from the tall vases of fresh flowers to the glint of polished cutlery. That was when Rachel saw her. At the far end of the dining room, a young girl sat alone at a lavishly set table. She was small, her legs tucked neatly under the seat of a sleek wheelchair, a pale blue dress falling gracefully over her knees. Before her sat an untouched cake, beautiful, intricate, and strangely untouched. The candle stood unlit, as though waiting for a moment that hadn't arrived. Rachel slowed her step. Something about the girl's stillness caught her attention. She didn't fidget like most children. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her gaze drifting toward the door every few seconds, as if searching for someone who hadn't come. Seated beside her was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a deep blue suit that seemed tailored precisely to him. His posture was perfect, his expression composed, but there was a tension in the way he watched the girl, as if trying to will her into smiling. Rachel recognized the look in his eyes. Not pity, but something more fragile, more dangerous. Fear. They reached their assigned table, but Rachel's focus kept drifting back to the pair in the corner. She knew what loneliness at a celebration felt like. Years ago, after her divorce, she'd celebrated Lucas's third birthday with a cake at their tiny kitchen table. Just the two of them, trying to make it feel like more than it was. The ache of those days had never entirely faded. She glanced down at Lucas, who was already swinging his legs under the table, his eyes curious as they roamed the room. "Do you see that girl over there?" she asked quietly. "The one in the blue dress?" Lucas nodded. "She looks sad." Rachel's throat tightened. "Yeah," she said softly. "She does." They ordered their food, but Rachel couldn't shake the image of the girl sitting there, staring at the cake. She noticed how the man leaned toward her every so often, speaking low, trying to keep her engaged. But the girl's smile, when it appeared, was small and fleeting, like a candle flame struggling against a draft. By the time the waiter brought their drinks, Rachel had made a decision she couldn't fully explain. She stood, smoothed the front of her blouse, and looked at Lucas. "Come with me for a second," she said. They walked across the dining room, the sound of quiet conversation following them like a tide. As they approached, Rachel saw the man's eyes lift to meet hers. They were brown, deep, assessing, cautious. His gaze flicked to Lucas, then back to her, as if calculating her intentions. "Hi," Rachel said, her voice calm but warm. She glanced at the girl and smiled gently. "I couldn't help noticing you've got a beautiful cake here. My son and I were wondering—" She hesitated for the briefest second, then asked the question that felt both simple and enormous. "Would you mind if we joined you?" The girl's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face before she looked at the man beside her. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then slowly, the girl's lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. Jonathan Reed studied Rachel for a moment longer, as though weighing something invisible between them. Finally, he gave a single nod, and just like that, the table was no longer empty. Rachel pulled out the chair across from the little girl, letting Lucas slip into the seat beside her. The table felt enormous between them, its polished surface reflecting the soft glow of the chandelier above. Up close, Rachel could see the girl's features more clearly. Delicate, with a quiet grace that didn't belong to most children her age. Her brown hair framed her face in smooth waves, and her eyes, they held an old kind of sadness, the kind that made Rachel's heart tighten. "I'm Rachel," she said gently, resting her hands on the table. "And this is my son, Lucas." "I'm Emma," the girl replied, her voice soft, almost shy. Lucas grinned at her, leaning forward just enough to be heard. "Hi, Emma. I like your cake. It's huge." That earned him the smallest of laughs, a quick puff of amusement that lit her face for a moment before fading. The man beside Emma sat back slightly, his gaze still fixed on Rachel. He radiated a quiet authority, the kind of presence that made her aware of her posture, the tone of her voice. "Jonathan Reed," he said finally, offering his name without embellishment. His voice was deep, controlled, the sort that carried even when spoken softly. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Reed," Rachel replied, though she sensed that politeness was only one layer of what passed between them. The waiter appeared, a flicker of surprise crossing his face at the expanded party. But Jonathan gave a small nod of approval, and the man quickly set extra menus in front of Rachel and Lucas. As the adults exchanged a few polite words, Lucas pulled a small toy dinosaur from his pocket and set it on the table. "This is Rexy," he told Emma. "He's been to, like, 4 birthday parties already. But none of them had a cake like yours." Emma leaned forward to examine the toy, her fingers brushing its plastic tail. "He's lucky," she said. "I don't get to go to many parties." Rachel saw the quick shadow that crossed Jonathan's face at that comment. He didn't interrupt, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Well," Lucas said matter-of-factly, "then this one can count for both of us. We'll be party friends." The sincerity in his voice made Emma smile again, and this time it lingered. They talked about small things at first: Lucas's school, Emma's favorite books, how the cake looked too pretty to eat. The waiter brought their drinks, and Jonathan quietly ordered for Emma, knowing her preferences without needing to ask. Rachel noticed the way he watched his daughter, not just with affection, but with the attentiveness of someone who'd learned to read every nuance in her expression. It was the same way she watched Lucas when he was tired or upset, a quiet vigilance born from love and worry combined. When the food arrived, the conversation loosened. Lucas animatedly described a science project he'd done, complete with sound effects. Emma listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made Lucas beam. Jonathan spoke little, but Rachel could feel his gaze occasionally settle on her, as if he was trying to figure out why she had walked over in the first place. At one point, Rachel excused herself to help Lucas cut his food into smaller bites. Jonathan leaned slightly toward her across the table. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his tone low, unreadable. "I know," she replied, meeting his eyes, "but no one should spend their birthday dinner alone." Something in his expression shifted, just slightly. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly, but there was a softness there now, a hint of something unspoken. By the time dessert came, the air at the table felt different. The cake was finally cut, golden candles lit and blown out, with Lucas cheering Emma on. Frosting smudged the corner of her mouth, and Jonathan, for the first time that evening, laughed. Quiet, genuine, and unguarded. Rachel caught the sound and stored it away, not realizing yet how much that small moment would matter in the days to come. The restaurant had grown quieter by the time the last crumbs of cake were brushed from the table. Most of the other guests had gone, leaving only the soft hum of staff clearing plates and the low crackle of the fireplace in the far corner. Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair, his hand resting on the edge of Emma's wheelchair. A protective gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. Rachel sipped the last of her tea, unsure if the evening was coming to a close or if she should say something more. She could feel the weight of unspoken things hanging in the space between them, as if they were all circling around a truth no one wanted to step into first. Lucas broke the quiet in the way only children could. "Emma, how come you don't go to school?" Rachel opened her mouth to hush him, but Emma answered before she could. "I do," she said simply. "Just not like most kids. I have a tutor at home. My dad says it's easier that way." Lucas frowned. "But don't you get bored?" Emma's eyes flicked to Jonathan, then back to Lucas. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I miss running around, playing in the yard, but I can't anymore." Her words landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but his voice when it came was steady. "Emma was in a car accident 2 years ago," he said, meeting Rachel's eyes for the first time as he spoke. "Her mother didn't survive." Rachel felt her chest constrict. She hadn't expected him to share something so personal. Not here, not now. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, the words feeling inadequate. Jonathan gave a small nod, as though he'd heard the phrase too many times to let it touch him anymore. "We've adjusted. She's stronger than most people give her credit for." Emma looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "That's because you're always there," she said. It was such a simple statement, but Rachel saw the flicker of emotion it stirred in Jonathan's eyes. A mix of pride and something heavier, almost like guilt. Lucas, in his usual unfiltered way, turned the question around. "My dad's not around," he said, glancing at Rachel. "He left when I was little. Mom says we're just fine without him." Jonathan's gaze shifted to Rachel again, and this time it held a question she didn't answer right away. She took a breath, feeling the old ache settle in her chest. "We managed," she said. "He decided fatherhood wasn't for him, so it's just been me and Lucas since he was 2. For a moment, Jonathan's expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. There was no pity in it, just recognition, as if he understood the shape of that kind of loneliness. "Do you have family here?" he asked. Rachel shook her head. My parents passed away when I was in college. I have an aunt in another state, but it's just easier to rely on ourselves." The waiter returned then, asking if they wanted anything else, but the conversation had shifted. The polite surface between them had cracked just enough to let something more honest through. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "It's not easy, doing it alone," he said. It wasn't a question. Rachel's eyes met his. "But you learn how." And you keep going, because you have to. Emma glanced between them, sensing the change in tone but stayed quiet. Lucas was already distracted by his toy again, running Rexy along the edge of the table. They stayed like that for a while. Four people who had been strangers just an hour ago, now linked by the faint, surprising thread of shared loss and survival. The night outside pressed dark against the windows, the city lights glowing in soft patterns, as if the world beyond this table had fallen away. Jonathan didn't know it yet, but he would remember this moment, the first time he let someone else sit with him in the shadows instead of facing them alone. A week passed before Rachel saw Jonathan and Emma again. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the air still carried a hint of early spring chill, and Lucas had begged her to take him to the botanical gardens. She hadn't expected to find them there. Jonathan, in his crisp navy coat, pushing Emma's wheelchair along the gravel paths between blooming cherry trees. They spotted each other almost at the same time. Rachel raised a hand in greeting, unsure if the encounter was welcome, but Emma's face lit up. "Lucas!" she called, her voice carrying across the path. Lucas didn't hesitate. He jogged over, falling into step beside her chair, talking animatedly about a new Lego set he'd built. Emma laughed, a sound so full and unguarded that it made Jonathan glance down at her with quiet wonder before looking back to Rachel. "Morning," he said, his tone polite, but softer than the last time they'd spoken. "Morning," she replied, matching his pace as they began to walk together. The garden was still quiet, the only sounds the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant splash of a fountain. They talked at first about simple things, the flowers in bloom, the unpredictable weather, how quickly children seem to grow. But there was an undercurrent to the conversation, a sense that both of them were aware of the invisible line between casual acquaintance and something more. At one point, Lucas darted ahead to look at the koi pond, leaving Rachel and Jonathan a few steps behind. Jonathan glanced sideways at her. "Emma's been asking about Lucas all week," he said. "She doesn't connect with many kids these days." Rachel smiled faintly. "Lucas is hard not to connect with. He has a way of just deciding someone's his friend and not letting go." Jonathan's gaze drifted toward his daughter. "I used to be like that. Before." She didn't need to ask before what. The weight in his voice made it clear. "It changes you," she said quietly. He nodded, his jaw tightening briefly. "The accident, it wasn't just losing my wife. It was watching Emma lose so much of her world overnight. I thought if I could control everything, her environment, her schedule, I could protect her from more loss. But maybe I've just been protecting her from living." The honesty in his words caught her off guard. For a man who seemed built on composure, this glimpse of vulnerability felt significant. They stopped near a bed of tulips, their petals opening toward the sun. Emma and Lucas were crouched at the edge of the pond now, Lucas pointing at a flash of orange beneath the water. Rachel glanced at Jonathan. "You're doing what you think is right. That's all any of us can do." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing the truth in her words. "And you? You've been doing it alone for years. Doesn't it ever—" He trailed off, searching for the right phrase. "Doesn't it ever feel impossible?" Her lips curved into a small, almost ironic smile. "Every other day. But then Lucas does something that makes me laugh. Or I realize we've made it through another month. And I think, maybe impossible is just another word for not yet." He looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite read. Part respect, part curiosity, and something warmer beneath. They spent the rest of the morning wandering the gardens together, the children moving ahead in bursts of chatter and laughter. Rachel noticed how Jonathan's attention never wavered from Emma, but he also didn't hover the way she'd expected. When Lucas helped push the wheelchair up a gentle slope, Jonathan let him, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. By the time they reached the entrance, the sun had climbed higher, casting a bright warmth over the paths. Emma hugged Lucas goodbye, an awkward, sweet gesture that made both children grin. Jonathan extended a hand to Rachel. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "For making her smile like that." His grip was warm, steady, and when she let go, she found herself thinking about it long after they'd walked away. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day Rachel would normally describe as forgettable. Overcast sky, the faint smell of rain in the air, the rush of parents waiting outside the community center where Lucas had his after-school program. She had been standing by the doors scrolling distractedly through her phone when the sound of hurried footsteps made her look up. Lucas's instructor, a middle-aged woman named Carol, was leading him toward her, one hand lightly on his shoulder. Lucas's face was pale, his usual boundless energy replaced by a sluggishness that made Rachel's stomach tighten. "Rachel," Carol said gently, "I think you should get him checked out. He got dizzy during the activity today and, well, it's not the first time I've noticed it." Rachel crouched down in front of her son. "Lucas? Honey, what's wrong?" "I'm fine," he mumbled, trying to shrug it off. But his hand gripped hers more tightly than usual. She thanked Carol, ushered Lucas to the car, and fought the rising tide of worry in her chest. She knew what this could mean. She'd known since the last time the doctor mentioned his heart murmur. The one they'd been monitoring for years. The one she'd hoped would never turn into something more. At home, Lucas went straight to his room, saying he was just tired. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. She stared at the steamless surface and felt the weight of decisions pressing in. Doctor appointments, hospital tests, the bills that would come after. That was when her phone buzzed. Jonathan's name lit up the screen. "Hey," she answered, trying to sound casual. "I was wondering if you and Lucas wanted to join us for dinner tomorrow," he said. "Emma's been—" He paused, the shift in her tone apparently not lost on him. "Rachel, what's wrong?" She hesitated. She didn't owe him an explanation. They'd only known each other for a few weeks. But the words came anyway. "Lucas wasn't feeling well today. I think it's his heart again." There was a brief silence on the other end, then Jonathan's voice came. Lower, more certain. "Which hospital do you take him to?" I'm going to call his pediatrician in the morning. Rachel," he said firmly, "let me help." She closed her eyes, leaning back in the chair. "I can handle it." "I know you can," he replied, his tone softer now. "But you don't have to. I have people. Doctors who've treated Emma, specialists. Let me make a few calls tonight." "This isn't your problem," she said, though even to her own ears the words sounded thin. "It became my problem the moment I cared about you and your son," he said. That admission stopped her. The air between them felt charged, even over the phone. She could almost picture him, standing in his office, one hand in his pocket, his gaze steady in a way that made people believe him when he said things like that. "I don't want charity," she whispered. "This isn't charity. It's making sure someone I care about gets what they need. There's a difference." By the time she hung up, she knew he wasn't going to let it drop. The next morning, she had a voicemail from one of the city's top pediatric cardiologists, offering to see Lucas that same day. No wait list, no paperwork delays. When she looked up from the message, Lucas was standing in the doorway, still pale but smiling faintly. "Is it okay if Emma comes to visit after?" he asked. Rachel forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. I think that would be nice." But deep down, she knew the truth. Jonathan Reed had just stepped across a line she'd kept in place for years, and she wasn't sure she could ever move him back again. The appointment had gone better than Rachel dared hope. Lucas's condition needed monitoring and likely a procedure within the year, but the cardiologist had been calm, thorough, and reassuring. More than that, he had taken the time to explain everything to Lucas in a way that made him feel brave instead of broken. It wasn't lost on Rachel that none of this would have happened without Jonathan's intervention. Still, she wasn't prepared for the way he kept showing up. Not just for the big moments, but in the quiet ones too. He texted to ask how Lucas was feeling, sent Emma over with a stack of her favorite adventure books, even had a driver deliver a week's worth of easy, healthy meals to Rachel's apartment so she wouldn't have to worry about cooking. She told herself it was just kindness. She told herself she wouldn't read into it. But then came the fundraiser. It was an annual charity gala for the Children's Rehabilitation Foundation, held at the grand ballroom of one of Jonathan's hotels. Rachel had planned to skip it. Black tie events weren't her world, but the foundation had been helping Emma with her adaptive therapy, and Jonathan insisted it would mean a lot for both her and Lucas to be there. She'd borrowed a simple navy dress from a friend, smoothing it nervously as she walked into the glittering room. The chandeliers spilled warm light over the crowd, the air thick with the scent of roses and the murmur of polite conversation. Lucas walked beside her in his one good suit, his hair combed into reluctant neatness. Jonathan found them almost instantly. He cut through the room with an ease that spoke of someone used to owning every space he entered. Tonight he wore a black tuxedo, the crisp white of his shirt making his brown eyes seem even darker. "You clean up well," he said with a small smile, his gaze lingering on her just long enough to make her pulse jump. The evening unfolded in a blur of speeches and silent auctions. Rachel kept mostly to the edge of the crowd, chatting with Emma when she wasn't being introduced to donors. Jonathan, ever the host, moved from group to group, but she noticed that he kept circling back to their table, as if checking to make sure they were still there. Then the bidding began for the night's main item, a week-long stay at a luxury villa in Italy, complete with private tours and a personal chef. The auctioneer's voice rose with each number, the crowd leaning forward in anticipation. And then Rachel heard it, Jonathan's voice calm but clear. 100,000. The room stilled for a moment. People turned, whispers starting. The sum was more than double the previous bid. Rachel's brow furrowed. She knew he could afford it, of course, but there was something about the way he sat back after placing the bid, his eyes flicking briefly toward her before settling on the auctioneer. When the gavel fell, the applause was loud and genuine. Jonathan leaned toward the microphone the auctioneer offered him. "I'd like to donate the Villa Week to the foundation," he said simply. "They can auction it again next year or gift it to a family in the program." Rachel realized then what he'd done. Not just spent money, but turned the spotlight entirely onto the cause, onto the children. There was no ego in it, no attempt to impress. It was loyalty, plain and powerful. After the applause died down, he returned to their table. Rachel studied him for a long moment, her chest tightening in a way she didn't expect. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. He shrugged as if it were nothing. "Some things are worth doing, even if you don't have to." She held his gaze, feeling the truth of it settle between them. For the first time in years, she realized she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She believed him. Spring returned slowly, as if testing the air before settling in for good. The city's parks filled with the scent of fresh blooms, and the days stretched longer, golden light lingering into the evening. At the edge of one of those parks, beneath a canopy of pale pink cherry blossoms, Jonathan had arranged a small picnic. Nothing elaborate, but everything chosen with care. Rachel arrived with Lucas, her hair loose around her shoulders, the wind catching strands and making them dance. She wore a light cream sweater and jeans, simple but beautiful in a way that made Jonathan's gaze linger a moment longer than he intended. Emma was already there, parked in her wheelchair on a plaid blanket, a stack of books beside her. "Finally," Emma called, her voice bright. "We've been waiting forever." Lucas laughed and dropped down onto the blanket beside her, already launching into a story about a soccer game he'd played at school. Jonathan watched the two children with a quiet satisfaction. The first time they'd met, Emma's smile had been cautious, almost hesitant. Now it came easily, full and unguarded. Rachel knelt beside the basket, unpacking sandwiches and fruit. "You made all this?" she asked, glancing at Jonathan. "I supervise," he said with a faint smirk, "which is my specialty." They ate together under the blossoms, the children talking over each other in bursts of excitement. Rachel found herself laughing more than she had in months, her shoulders relaxing in a way she hadn't realized they'd been tense. Every so often, she caught Jonathan watching her, not in a way that demanded anything, but with a steady warmth that felt like an anchor. After lunch, the kids wandered off to explore the edge of the pond, Emma maneuvering her chair with practiced ease while Lucas pointed out ducks and skipped stones. Jonathan and Rachel stayed on the blanket, the space between them filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of the children's laughter. "You've changed her life," Rachel said quietly, watching Emma and Lucas in the distance. He shook his head. "They've both changed mine." She looked at him then, really looked. The man who had once seemed untouchable, driven, self-contained, walled off, now sat beside her, open in a way that felt both rare and deliberate. "Jonathan, I've spent so long standing on my own 2 feet, it's hard to remember how to let someone else in." "I'm not asking you to forget how to stand," he said, his voice low, steady. "I'm asking you to let me stand with you." The words landed deep, not with the shock of something new, but with the inevitability of something she'd been moving toward for weeks. Rachel smiled just a little, shaking her head. "You make it sound so easy." "It is," he said, and for the first time she believed it. The children returned, cheeks flushed, and plopped back onto the blanket. Emma leaned into her father's side, Lucas stretching out beside Rachel. The afternoon sun filtered through the blossoms, painting them all in soft light. Later, as they packed up, Rachel found herself standing close enough to Jonathan that the warmth from him reached her. She hesitated only a second before taking his hand. His fingers closed around hers instantly, a silent promise. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For being here. For all of it." He looked at her, his expression calm but certain. "I told you, Rachel, I'm not going anywhere." And as they walked back toward the park gates, their children laughing ahead of them, Rachel realized she believed him completely. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like home. This story was never just about love. It was about the courage to step out of isolation and let someone in. Jonathan began as a man whose life was built on control, on the belief that he could protect his daughter by keeping the world at arm's length. Rachel lived with the quiet strength of a single mother, convinced she had to carry every weight alone. What made their journey powerful wasn't a grand romantic gesture or a dramatic rescue. It was the small, consistent moments of showing up. Jonathan's steady presence, Rachel's openness with her vulnerability, and the children's natural, unguarded bond broke down the walls they'd both been living behind. By the end, the happy ending wasn't just that they found each other. It was that they found a shared place where trust could grow, where love was steady and safe, and where both families could finally feel complete. Sometimes the most life-changing moments come not from the plans we make, but from the people who appear when we least expect them and choose to stay.